The story begins in the urban setting of Seoul on yet another ordinary day, where each civilian was going about their daily routines. However, in the midst of the calm of an ordinary day, everything changes when a young man with an athletic build suddenly appears. The young man was confused. He slowly looks around and doesn't recognize the place. He had no idea where he was. Much more than that, upon looking at his reflection in a car, he couldn't even remember who he was, realizing that he was unable to recall his own name. Despite being completely lost, when he looked closely at himself, he recognized that he was wearing some kind of military uniform, questioning why, but still unable to find an answer in his mind. It didn't matter what it was, whether his name, where he was, or what he was doing. The young man simply couldn't remember anything. However, as his confused mind wandered in his disorganized thoughts, the protagonist suddenly hears a sharp noise, and it was as if something was triggered. As soon as he heard the noise, his body instinctively reacted, spinning on its axis and delivering a direct punch to whatever was behind him in a fraction of a second. The punch ended up hitting a tree behind him, and the noise he heard was nothing more than birds chirping. But even so, his attack was enough to destroy the tree entirely. The nearby civilians stared at the feat in astonishment, but far more surprised than they were was the young man himself, wondering where that kind of strength and insane reflexes had come from. He stares at his fist. But before he had time to organize his own thoughts, he is interrupted by a voice resonating inside his head. That robotic voice greets its agent, introducing itself as a tactical support artificial intelligence implanted inside his body. That fact makes our protagonist curious, but he wastes no time and already asks the artificial intelligence where and when they were, a doubt that is quickly satisfied by the integrated system, which replies confirming that they were in 2024. Nevertheless, it continues clarifying that it, in 2024 turn, was a model of military intelligence coming from 2082. That information surprises the young man, who at first disbelieves the possibility of that being true, but soon he questions the system again, considering the possibility that he too had come from the future, but his answer was denied. Apparently, the artificial intelligence's data had also been reset, and it was unable to provide that kind of information due to losing its memory just like him. As the two were conversing, a traffic signal is mysteriously damaged as a truck passed nearby. Because of that misfortune, the vehicle's driver ends up advancing too far and colliding with another car, which is forced to swerve towards people. At that moment, the nameless young man sees a strange message appearing in front of him. It was the system warning him of the danger as, from a distance, the car that swerved collides abruptly with a metal fence with enough force to hurl a metal pole directly in the protagonist's direction. The pole flies at high speed, but he is faster and dodges in time. But a civilian right behind him wasn't so lucky and was pierced by the sharp tip of the shaft. A civilian had just been seriously injured, and chaos spread through the street as several people gathered around the fallen body of the wounded man. The boy briefly found all those colorful messages that helped him dodge Strange, but his biggest concern was the unlucky civilian who had just been hurt. The injury was extremely severe, and until he could figure out a way to the hospital and take him there, the civilian would certainly die. He begins to consider his options to help, but what cuts off his reasoning is the system, suggesting surgery right there. He immediately refuses, stating that he was incapable of doing that on his own, but the system clarifies that it wasn't talking about him, but about itself. The protagonist questions the system about how that would be possible, and it continues saying that he just needed to assess the patient's condition and let it take control. It was clear that the young man still had many questions to ask that thing in his head, but due to the emergency, he ends up agreeing and approaches the wounded civilian. Crouching in front of his body, the boy analyzes the wound caused by the shaft, a little anxious about whether the system could really treat it. But with just a few seconds of analysis, it had already managed to identify the materials necessary for an improvised surgery and informs him: a needle, thread, knife, and disinfectant only. And upon hearing that, it was obvious the boy didn't believe, thinking it was too little. Amidst the victim's desperation as he agonized on the ground, a nearby civilian noticed the unnamed protagonist's certain knowledge, asking if he could administer first aid and offering help with that. And despite not knowing if he should really trust the words of an artificial intelligence that he didn't even know what it was, he relays exactly what it requested to the other civilian. That said, the request quickly spread among the nearby people, who gradually volunteered, offering all the requested materials in the hope that he was a doctor or something similar. The pressure of people's gazes on the boy's shoulders was palpable, but the reality was that he had no idea what to do with that. He asks the integrated system how to proceed, and it demands that temporary control be granted to it, so that it could at least control its host's hands. The boy hesitates, but since time was short, he grants permission, letting himself be carried away by the urgency of the situation. A message notifies the consummation of temporary control, and immediately his hands begin to move on their own. That sensation was strange, but it was undeniable that under the system's control, his hands moved incredibly fast and with truly surgical precision. The metal shaft was easily removed from the body, and with fluidity, the needle along with the thread was used to block the bleeding and close the wound, performing the surgery perfectly. Everything was going incredibly well. At that pace, that man would be saved without any problems. But a message indicating excessive blood loss appears. That shatters the protagonist's expectations, who once again, worried, he asks the artificial intelligence if it was sure of what it was doing, but it didn't answer him. The chances of the civilian's survival were decreasing more and more, and to make things worse, his hands, controlled by the system, suddenly stopped. That moment, the civilian on the verge of death agonizes, spitting even more blood, and at that point, even the protagonist knew that didn't mean anything good. In the end, the patient was safely taken to a hospital later and was treated with appropriate surgery. And hours later, right after the hospital surgery was performed, a doctor questions one of the surgeons about the condition of the injured civilian. The surgeon in charge sighs, retorting that he had survived and was fine, which leads the doctor to wonder if the injury wasn't as serious as they thought. But the surgeon quickly denies that statement, reinforcing that when he opened the man to perform the surgery, he was completely terrified, and that if it weren't for someone stopping the bleeding beforehand, he wouldn't even have made it to the ambulance. In the middle of this explanation, the doctor asks again what the problem was that left his colleague so distressed, to which he dryly replies, stating that the wound had been closed with ordinary sewing thread. That alone already leaves the doctor stunned, but it didn't stop there. The surgeon continues pointing out how frighteningly perfect the stitching of the wound was. It was as if it had been done by a machine. The doctor adjusts his glasses, saying that it was just ridiculous, but the surgeon was as serious as he had ever been. He himself couldn't believe it when he saw it. However, the conversation between the two professionals is interrupted by the arrival of a man. This man introduces himself as Park Ki-jung, the detective in charge. He asks how the patient was while approaching the doctors. The surgeon states that he was perfectly fine, and then retorts, asking if the rumors were true about the patient's initial surgery having been performed on the streets. The agent confirms, and he was just as surprised as they were. Apparently, the man who performed the procedure did it all improvisationally with a utility knife. Both doctors didn't know that detail, so logically, when they learned about it, it was impossible to hide the surprise on their faces. The detective becomes confused by that reaction, asking if that would be such a complicated procedure, and the surgeon exclaims that it was obvious that definitely wasn't the type of surgery that could be done in the middle of the street, especially so perfectly with only a utility knife at hand. Believe it or not, that was undoubtedly what all the witnesses claimed, and no matter how much the doctors questioned their disbelieving methods, it was clear that somehow, whoever that guy was, what he did was nothing less than a miracle. That was insane. They immediately asked the detective if he knew where that individual might be now, but after performing the procedure, it seemed he just left quietly before the ambulance even arrived. A terrifying silence falls over the group after that. What had just happened was certainly not normal. Since the question about his whereabouts had been raised, the protagonist now found himself in another place in Seoul, in a public restroom. At the moment, he was washing his hands, relieved. He confesses to the system in his mind that when it suddenly stopped back then, he thought it had given up, even though it was just calculating the surgical route. Taking advantage of that moment of calm, after asking the system, because he had lost his memories and discovered that apparently someone had reset his data, he asks for his name, and since the system stated that he still didn't have a defined one, he decided to name himself. Since the system was an artificial intelligence support, he shortens his name to John in reference to this. Faced with the protagonist's proposal, a sharp silence permeates the bathroom, to the point where he questions the artificial intelligence about its silence again. But the reality is that it was just processing its new name and adding it to the data. As the young man exited the public bathroom, he admits that he also had the idea of naming it Black Flame Dragon, but that idea is instantly dismissed by Jeon Ji-in, who asserts that its current name is already good enough. It was surprising to know that Jian also had autonomous thought, but the protagonist takes the opportunity to ask about the strange uniform he was wearing. It had the emblem of a called Terra Union, which led him to conclude that he was possibly a future agent belonging to this company. But despite this, he was unable to think of any reason why he had ended up in the past, something that even John himself had no data about. The young man suggests the possibility of the system using the internet to acquire data that could lead to some clues, but the system denies it. Its capability was limited precisely to avoid hacker attacks. Therefore, this was impossible. It is then explained that Jian, instead of using devices like the internet, collects data only through the body of its host, experiencing their same sensations and constantly adding them. The information releases are executed through the young man's body and voice, being able to provide assistance in combat and intervene only when temporary control is granted to it. Even so, there are things it cannot do even with temporary control, such as directly helping by pulling the trigger of a weapon or something similar. Listening attentively to all the explanation given by John, he concludes that to eventually acquire information about why they were there, he would have to experience everything with his body. And with that said, and confirmed by Jian itself afterward, the protagonist has an idea about what they could do. That would be their first mission. He crosses a good part of the city and then heads to the first cyber cafe he found along the way. His clear certainty of where he should go impresses the system, which asks him if he has recovered his memory. But no, for the protagonist, that only sounded like common sense if what they wanted was to gather information. The only problem they had to face now was simply one: money. And since they had nothing with them, they needed to find a way to get money to enter. Evaluating their options, the protagonist questions John if it would be able to use its vocal cords or something similar, which to his surprise it confirms. Without further ado, the young man then grants temporary control to the system, which takes him to a central park and prepares everything for the show. The fact that a system designed for combat had the capacity to sing amazed the protagonist, who couldn't help but question how that could possibly be useful in combat. Apparently, this type of device served as a kind of motivation to motivate allies, which was quite dubious, but he doesn't question it further, and asks why the system specifically chose that place to sing. There were several other eager singers in that square singing simultaneously and calling audience attention. So thinking about the idea of surpassing them in some way seemed quite impossible. The system states bluntly that all he needs to do is draw more attention than the other singers by demonstrating a greater ability. But once again, the guy doesn't see himself as so convinced. The idea that the system for drawing attention ends up making him look like a court jester worried him. He draws John's attention, asking him only not to overdo it too much with all that, but he simply ignores him and reaffirms that it was showtime. Nevertheless, the guy positioned a donation box he had managed to get right in front, and then, in preparation, sighed. He began to sing. His beautiful acoustic melody with versatile sound resonated throughout the square, immediately capturing the attention of all the people nearby. A variety of sounds and different songs were vociferated with perfection, able to enchant everyone who, in an instant, dropped what they were doing or left other bands just to admire the talent of that star. Not even the protagonist himself, who had just been devoid of hope, believed in his own performance, which captivated the entire audience immaculately. Whether it was his ability to rise and lower tones, sound time, or even vocal versatility to the point of imitating deep and feminine voices, no one was able to define that as anything less than angelic. However, as that small performance continued, little by little, some individuals in the audience began to notice that guy only sang the songs from the middle, without the beginning. That continuity error was due to the fact that Zhang had only been able to collect those sounds as they passed by on the street, but regardless, people didn't seem to mind much and threw a shower of money at that talented singer. This continued until they seemed to have already collected enough. So, with no more reason to stay there, he took off as soon as possible with the money he had made, ignoring the audience's protests for him to sing more. Meanwhile, all this was happening. A blonde woman seemed to watch that from a distance inside the cyber cafe. She was genuinely amazed, both by the guy and by his performance. But before she could admire him a little more, a request came up needing her attention. The girl immediately moved away from the window to return to work. But that man she saw in the square simply wouldn't leave her head. She couldn't help but feel frustrated, as she just wanted to have heard him sing a little longer. With all the necessary money in hand, the agent discusses with John the possibility of finding some clues about the ground union as well as their purpose online. But he was also concerned about the possibility of them not finding anything, and without that, they really had no other direction. Jian says that at the moment, the priority was just to infiltrate the local environment discreetly, to later contact the command center. A fluid way to infiltrate discreetly was what occupied the mind of the unnamed protagonist. That is, until a flyer caught his attention on the wall. Apparently, the cyber cafe was hiring, and seeing that, the solution for a way to infiltrate discreetly immediately came to his mind. The system congratulates him for thinking of that, reinforcing that in that way both the problem of food and information gathering would be solved at once. That was certainly the best option. As he enters the establishment, the guy also thinks about the possibility of sleeping there if he actually manages to get the job, but he suddenly realizes something. He had no appropriate clothes for that occasion. That was a problem, but it seemed that the system already had a solution prepared for that. His military uniform was made of special chameleon fibers, which allowed him to change its shape and appearance into virtually anything he desired. The young man was surprised by such a convenient feature coming from that suit, but he didn't complain. It was perfect, so he immediately wanted to give it a chance. A few moments passed, and his uniform was finally ready, being a headbanger outfit. The protagonist himself admitted that he put that together thinking of the singers he saw earlier in the park, but as far as the system was concerned, all it had was the pure and absolute silence. In the midst of this, a duo of two boys climbed the stairs talking to each other, and as they talked, they eventually came across the protagonist in his rather peculiar uniform. An awkward, long silence settled in the environment. This was until they just lowered their heads and walked past that weirdo, pretending he didn't exist. The agent pointed out the strangeness of the two boys to a confused John, but even the system itself ended up agreeing that that outfit was ridiculous. A few more minutes passed, and he decided to change his clothes for something more normal and truly discreet. Thus, receiving John's approval, they finally entered the cyber cafe. As soon as he stepped into the space, the protagonist directed his gaze to his surroundings, allowing the system to scan the entire room. In a fraction of a second, everything about the establishment was captured by John, from payment methods, food, places of residence, and much more. His final conclusion was that that place was appropriate. That said, the young man nodded, and then looked for the owner of the establishment, informing him that he was looking for a job as stated in the flyer. The only problem was that, as requested, he had no identity, but due to the lack of employees, the owner ended up overlooking this. However, despite the young man's interest and his pretty face for selling, the owner of the cyber cafe still had many doubts about his culinary skills, an image that his figure did not convey very well. That was a place that sold food. So as usual, the boss asked the protagonist if he could even use a frying pan. This he confirmed, when John also confirmed that this did not escape his capabilities. Thus, the owner asked the young man to make him a fried rice to see if he was that good, an order that the agent complied with, and without hesitation headed to the kitchen area. John already started his analysis of the necessary ingredients, and at his host's request, he asked for the use of his hands to do the job, something he granted immediately. With temporary control given, his body again began to move on its own, and the protagonist felt that nostalgic sensation passing through his body. It was strange. When the system took over his body, he moved with such fluidity that it was as if his body remembered how to do that. Each of his movements was perfect and calculated, to the point that when he caught the boss's attention, he was astonished by the immense speed and agility with which that disguised agent performed the entire process. The boss himself, amid his shock, admitted thinking that the young man would only cook a frozen, pre-prepared rice. But no, he was making everything from scratch. And not only that, that man was going beyond just rice. He was cooking eggs and vegetables in the mix, turning it into a complete meal in a matter of minutes. In just a few moments, everything was ready, and the food was delivered to the boss for him to taste, still in shock for having been able to see those hands, surgical in action of so fast that they moved. That was too surreal to be real, and the middle-aged man tried to convince himself that this dish was made in a hurry and that it couldn't have been cooked properly. He took a spoon and grabbed a piece, putting it in his mouth to prove to what elevated a small suspense. Despite having tasted it himself before offering the food to his future boss, even the young man began to feel uncertain about the taste. However, when the owner of the cyber cafe tasted the food and rested the spoon on the table, he confirmed that it was absolutely delicious, being taken to heights by that immaculate composition of flavors, hopping around, and for a moment even forgetting that he was in a cyber cafe. The older man congratulated his new employee for making him feel that nostalgic sensation, but in the midst of this, the same blonde girl from before arrived at the place. She arrived at a great time, as her presence allowed the boss to introduce her as Cha Eun-seo, his niece, and from now on, the protagonist's co-worker. As soon as she laid her eyes on her new co-worker, Yoon-seo immediately recognized him as the same singer she had seen in the square earlier. Her ability to identify him instantly surprised him, but she continued, admiring that coincidence, wondering why someone with so much talent like him ended up in a cyber cafe, and he merely retorted that he was just good at anything. The system in the midst protested, asserting that who was good at anything was truly him, but the protagonist told it to be quiet. By accident, he ended up saying this out loud to Yoon-seo, but quickly apologized. That was not for her. Regardless, that new employee easily won over the boss with his cooking skills. That talent was well valued, especially since the only employee there was incapable of cooking even instant food. The boss asked the young man if he had any preferred working hours, and embracing that opportunity, although it sounded quite presumptuous, he demanded part-time shifts with flexible hours, and besides that, he asked to stay in the storage room while working there. Those conditions requested by the young man were quite harsh, but upon thinking better, the boss recognized more than anyone that a gem like that was too valuable to let go, especially considering the competition. He agreed. The man accepted all the conditions offered by the young man, and to ensure he would stay, he even offered double payment, as long as his cooking improved sales. The words double payment echoed in his mind until two new customers entered the cyber cafe at that very moment. They complained about having to eat food from a cyber cafe that was supposedly terrible, but were interrupted by the protagonist who took that as a challenge. He said he would cook for them, and that they could only say his food was bad after tasting it. The protagonist cooked the same rice he had proposed to make earlier, while both the boss and his niece admired his skills. While cooking, the young man extended his hand and requested a plate for Yoon-seo, who carelessly ran to grab one and handed it to him. As soon as he received the plate, he just poured the delicacy into the container with precision and voila, it was ready. The blonde girl was surprised by that immense speed, but she didn't even have time to be impressed, as at her uncle's command, she quickly took the plate to the clientele. And while all the food was being prepared by complete, the two clients had just sat down at their computers, commenting on the boldness of the new employee. They had no expectations and believed that this was just a desperate marketing game from the cyber cafe, but even before they could hit play on their games, the dish had already arrived. That speed scared them, but even more than that was the extremely luxurious appearance of that dish in the waitress's hands. That dish was so well presented that the customer even thought about the possibility that they had been given the wrong order. After all, they had only ordered rice, but that delicacy was their order. A fact, as confirmed by the waitress herself, who stared at the dish she had delivered as if she were going to eat it herself. The two clients were a bit reluctant, but decided to give it a chance, grabbing a spoon and taking a portion to taste. And the effect was instant. Just by tasting a small spoonful of that food, false memories were projected in their minds as part of a strange feeling of nostalgia they felt when tasting the perfection of that dish. Their eyes were tearing up, and they were unable to contain that radiant feeling just for themselves, exclaiming how good it was while asking for more. The exaggerated reaction of the two clients ended up catching the attention of the other people present in the cyber cafe who were curious and asked to try it too. A wave of orders then followed one after the other, and when it returned to her boss, she left him in shock by announcing that within minutes there had been 12 new orders. Faced with that immense wave of orders, the boss looked at the protagonist, asking him if he could handle all of that, and he redirected that question to Jung, who confirmed that yes, cooking on a large scale was the main function of that ability. After all, it was necessary to keep an entire army very well fed. That said, the young man agreed, giving him control and then rolling up his sleeves. What followed were 3 arduous and tireless hours of work. But during that period of just one afternoon, the cyber cafe sold like never before in all of history. The boss was amazed to see that river of money. The protagonist had throughout that time his mind focused on the double payment, which he asked his boss if it was still on, and he didn't hesitate to confirm. After that, The boss asked that noble young man for his name, something that he, after thinking about it for a few seconds, responded by introducing himself as Kang In. That said, the older man congratulated him on his exemplary work and said he would prepare his place in the storage room right away. During the dialogue, Jung asked him if he had recalled his real name, given how specific he was in his selection. But he denied it, saying it was just on the tip of his tongue. Regardless of that, the system said that if that was the case, then it would be better to define Kang In as his name until his real name came up, which the young man agreed to without any problems. Then, Kang In continued working until the end of his shift, now finding himself in front of one of the computers during his break time. With his arms crossed, he was worried. They had secured a place to stay, but to receive any type of payment, an identity was needed. Thinking of a way out of that situation, he asked Jiang if he was capable of hacking, something confirmed by him having hacking techniques from the year 2082. Kang In suggested hacking a bank if that was the case, but since it was merely an auxiliary system, Zhang proves to be incapable of this. His hacking capabilities were limited solely to infiltrations, and only that. That was expected. But assuming Zhang would be infiltrating in 2024 for some secret mission, he questions whether he would at least be able to forge an identity. And now that, he says he is capable of merely requesting temporary control. Permission granted, the system begins to invade the government data center to forge the identity as requested. It was a long and tedious process, which made Kang In feel drowsy, but at the system's command, he opens his eyes, and when he does, he encounters something unusual. In Kang In, there already existed, whether name, face, or even fingerprints. Both were exactly the same in every aspect. That left the protagonist completely perplexed and confused. That shouldn't be possible after all. Everything indicated that he was from 2082 just like Zhang. That mystery piqued his curiosity, and he fervently begins to research the so-called Ground Federation on his uniform. But even so, there was no record of it in 2024. He wonders if there was a possibility that he had existed in two timelines simultaneously, but even Zhang didn't have enough data to determine that. More and more, all of this made less sense. With a fierce look, he orders Zhang to dig deeper into the personal information of this Kang In, but there was no record at all. The only information that was obtained about him was that he was unemployed. While Kang In racks his brain, he is then surprised by Yoon Seo, who appears behind him before he has a chance to hide what he was doing. Fortunately, she was naive and clueless, so even seeing all that code, she just assumed he was developing a program or something similar. With a sullen face, he asks her what the girl was doing, pointing out that it was rude to look at what others were doing on the computer, and she just laughs, pulling out a credit card and saying that her uncle had lent it to her to make purchases for the store with him. Kang In lets out a sigh of relief at the fact that the girl hadn't really paid attention to what he was doing, and ends up agreeing to go shopping with her. Outside of work, Kang In and Yoon Seo stroll through the square, with the girl praising the speed with which the young man managed to separate all the items for purchase, something he admits he only did thanks to the system, which selected the best quality ones. Not only that, but she also points out the young man's very prominent strength, saying that his arms seemed almost to be made of metal. Zhang sarcastically interjects in the middle of this to stop praising him. After all, everything Kang In has is only because of him, but Kang In cuts him off saying that wasn't true. But again, out loud, Yoon Seo misunderstands and says that it was just a metaphor, but Kang In explains that he wasn't really talking to her when he said that. Their path seemed to be coming to an end, but the blonde wanted to spend more time with the guy, suggesting that they stop at another cyber cafe to eat something, even if just for a moment. Kang In declines after all. All of this would end up going on his boss's credit card, but the girl insists, saying that he was her uncle so there wouldn't be a problem. But she is interrupted when a man bumps into her. The bump was forceful and intentional, abruptly pushing the woman against the protagonist, who catches her. The man who bumped into her strikes an intimidating pose, warning the woman to watch where she's going if she didn't want to die. Kang In and the gangsters exchange glances, and he seems to notice something. The tension emerged in the scene, and the system was able to feel the hostile intentions exhaled by those men. They were framed as a possible threat. Keeping that in mind, Zhang asks his master about the pertinence of activating combat mode. That heavy atmosphere between them, however, is suddenly broken by Yoon Seo's exasperated screams. The blonde was screaming and crying out loud, desperately apologizing to the men, and incredibly enough, the woman's sudden outburst managed to appease the tension established between them. This opened a gap for one of the men to explain himself, saying that his colleague's response was only due to his bad mood after losing all the games he played. And having said that, they simply let them go and passed by, leaving. The tension was gone, and the system ensured the state of security. With no more problems along the way, the two returned to the cyber cafe. But upon arrival, Yunseo is greeted by her uncle, shouting her name. Seeing the concern on the old man's face, the young woman approaches, asking him why he was so nervous. And with a dejected look, the boss emphasizes the chaos inside the cyber cafe, stating that the internet had been cut off without notice, causing a great problem. Hearing that, Kang-in asks the system if it could have anything to do with his hacking into the government database, and if they had somehow been tracked, which the latter denies immediately. With the hacking technology of the 2000s and 20s, something like that should be impossible, so they both mutually agree that the most pertinent thing would be to check it out themselves. Kang-in catches his boss's attention, asking where the server was and offering to help fix it without the need to call a specialist. With the consensus of his boss, he accesses the cyber cafe's server, and although there are no traces of anyone trying to track them, Jong detects that it was evident that someone tried to hack them. The protagonist disbelieves that this could be possible. After all, it was just a cyber cafe. But Jong reinforces this by pointing to the personal information hacking program installed on the device, and then states that the connection drop must be related to the hacking activities. Kang-in finds himself worried, but asks Jong to look further into the case, granting him temporary control. And after just a few moments of research, the system manages to identify the location. That signal was present in 7 different regions, but one of them was extremely close to where they were. This makes Kang-in think, soon assuming that someone nearby had used a computer to test it. He begins to suspect that the culprits might have been the bullies from earlier. Regardless, despite his theories and thoughts on the case, the boy's line of reasoning is suddenly interrupted by a scream. It was a customer, complaining to the attendant Yunseo that the connection drop had ruined his game match. Yunseo tries to apologize and offer some free time compensation, but the boy was too furious to care about that and kept yelling. Kang-in decides to set aside what he was doing and asks the system if it had a solution for that, and Jong quickly responds, suggesting offering food. A screen with some battlefield snacks appears in front of him for his choice, and the protagonist chooses the third one for being the least expensive. Everything ready, hands-on. While Yunseo was still trying to calm the enraged customer, the boy already returned with the dish ready. And, as an apology for the connection drop, he offers the young customer that snack on the house. Obviously, the customer, still furious and upset, didn't see how that could make up for losing a game match because of it. But even in his ignorance, he accepts the gesture and decides to give it a try. With the cup in hand, he aggressively throws some cereal into his mouth. And when he tastes it, once again, the protagonist's culinary skills do not disappoint, making that once furious boy calm his nerves instantly as if by magic. No, more than that, his energy was restored, and he felt euphoric. It was like feeling heaven in his mouth. And from one extreme to the other, as if he hadn't even been angry seconds ago, he asks for more and happily returns to what he was doing. Yunseo is astonished and wonders what kind of magic he had put into that thing to make such a miracle happen before trying it herself. And even after tasting it, she couldn't believe what she was feeling. As described by her, the flavor was perfectly balanced, a delight to the palate. And amazed, she praises the boy's culinary skills, who just makes up any excuse. With the problem solved, he states that he will return to what he was doing and says that he made a few more additional snacks to calm other possible alarmed customers and leaves. And as he goes, the woman, still amazed by how eclectic that boy was, begins to see him differently. Her heart beats faster, and as ironic as it was, she starts associating his image with that of a hero from times modern. After that, Kang-in walks through the city on his way to the hacker who caused that. Under the protagonist's command, Jong already consents and activates the navigation mode so that both could search for the culprits. And it didn't take long, for in a matter of moments, the system had already found the hidden location of the criminals. Decided to investigate that case further, Kang-in enters the suspect's hideout, climbing the stairs until he hears a noise and hides. At first, the noise wasn't discernible, but with Jong's help, he amplifies the sound so that it could be heard even from there. And what he hears is the voice of a young, innocent civilian who apparently, as it seemed, was being forced to program some kind of program against his will. The system only reinforces, confirming that the first voice was certainly of a student being threatened, which was already obvious. And knowing this, Kang-in doesn't hesitate and decides he will intervene. Inside the locked room, A young boy with glasses was being beaten by the same bullies seen earlier at the casino. But that didn't last much longer, as soon the door of that place was easily broken down by the protagonist with a single kick. That was unexpected, and it scares everyone. Both the unknown boy initially thought the protagonist was one of the bullies, and the bullies themselves were confused, as they were sure they had locked the door. Regardless, the biggest of the bullies steps forward, threatening to kill the unwanted guest. But it was futile, for before he realized it, he was hit square in the face with a punch. And that punch alone was enough to take down the big guy without any difficulty. An Seong-hwan was just a normal student at the Common Korean University. He had always been interested in hacking tricks since he was little. That was an entire world that fascinated him, and after years he became quite a competent hacker, to the point of being proud to give tips even to professional hackers in that field. Although he was great at what he did, Hwan never had any real job with that thing. But all of that changed when he received a recruitment message in his email. It was a dream job. The working hours were minimal, and the pay equaled an entire month of part-time work. The boy soon got excited and accepted the job without even thinking twice. He believed he had hit the jackpot, but it was all a scam. That wasn't a legitimate company. He was threatened and forced to work, being beaten and abused practically for free. But that day, while the bullies once again hit him, a hero, in his own words, finally appeared. Right after the fall of the gangster, Kang-in pauses to think if he had done the right thing by advancing without thinking in that way. But much more than that, he was genuinely surprised by the abnormal strength of his body, for having been able to take down someone much bigger than him with just one punch. Surprises aside, the system interrupts his admiration for his own body and alerts him about the weapons detected in the possession of the threats. That briefly worries the protagonist, but Jong soon assures him that there was no way to lose. With a synthetically enhanced body and his assistants together, his chance of victory was absolutely 100%. That said, Kang-in raises his index finger and shouts a very blatant provocation against the two who remained, calling them cowardly octopuses. And surprisingly enough, that provocation actually worked. The hostility of the gangsters rose even more than expected. One of them, driven by fury, pulls out a knife that he had kept it in his pocket and moved towards the protagonist who, after eliciting that expected reaction from him, didn't even bother. Before his opponent could even handle his knife, he was already hit by an upward kick under his chin, lifting him against the ceiling, brutally embedding him in the area. The second one contains his surprise, pulling out another knife from beneath his clothes and rushing in an attempt to attack Kang-in. But it proves to be totally futile, as all the young man had to do was lower his elevated leg for a downward kick to the back of the same, making him lose consciousness instantly. That blow even leaves the protagonist himself stunned, who comments on how mechanical his attacks were. And it was no wonder. After all, according to Jaeon himself, his kicks were approximately 5 times stronger than those of a normal man, even without using all his strength. On the other side of the room, An Seong-hwan watches the whole action completely stunned. The fact that he saw that young man murmuring inaudible things to himself kept him on alert, fearing that he might be some sort of police agent or similar, particularly even being a hacker who had never really done anything serious. Thinking about the idea of possibly going to jail for the trivial things he had caused with his skills throughout his life worried him a lot. In fact, a lot is still too little. He gets totally desperate, and out of fear, even without being accused of anything, he tries desperately to explain himself. John analyzes the boy, soon assuring Kang-in that there was a 90% chance he was being truthful and classifying him as a harmless hacker. That ability surprises the young man, and apparently, the system was capable of discerning truths from lies based on the facial expressions and behaviors of those being questioned, with the accuracy increasing the more pressured they were. Hearing this, Kang-in is still not convinced with that 10% chance that the boy might be lying and quickly approaches him. He crouches in front of the victim and naturally asks him what he was doing there. Calming down, the young man explains that he was deceived by a job offer, being locked up there for 3 consecutive days until that point. He was forced to work on illicit things continuously, and that piques the protagonist's curiosity, who asks him what those things would be, and the hacker responds that what he was being forced to do was stock manipulation. Kang-in finds it strange. Those guys didn't seem even remotely capable of that sort of thing. However, Hwan continues. Apparently, he was the one forced to create the stock manipulation program, and all they did was install it in local cyber cafes. At that moment, the agent finally connects the dots. So that's what they were doing in the cyber cafe earlier. Everything had been explained. They were certainly involved in a stock manipulation scheme, but that episode led him to conclude that those were just henchmen. For Kang In, it was a relief that they weren't after him, but still he would eventually have to deal with whoever was behind it. Nonetheless, he suggests to the boy to call the police. Huang worries for a moment about putting him in trouble that way, but Kang In assures him that everything will be fine. Well, his identity wasn't compromised by the mask, and the fact that he was just someone passing by who decided to save him wasn't a lie. After that, with nothing left for him there, Kang In says goodbye to leave, but is interrupted by the same boy. The protagonist stops, and with a bit of hesitation, the boy asks him to wait a little longer and asks if he can get back at those scammers. Kang In questions the reason for the question, but it turns out Huang was afraid one of them would wake up in the middle of it and wanted to make sure he would protect him. The young man just stops and assures him that after a hit like that, none of them would wake up, and assures him he could feel free to do whatever he wanted. Huang gets excited, and finally, with the opportunity to get back at them, he prepares his strongest punch against one of the unconscious men. And his punch was so weak and harmless that the body didn't even move. However, against all expectations, after that nudge, one of the men suddenly stood up. Neither of them expected that, and that eerie sight gave them both a mutual fright. The police arrived at the establishment, and the local officers looked at the whole scene in disbelief. They were confused, after all. The way the criminals had been beaten up wasn't normal, and they wondered what had happened there. Huang speaks up, explaining to the guards his situation and the whole story of how he had fallen into a scam and had been trapped there for forced labor for 3 days, as well as the threats. The officer making the report of the case didn't believe it much, questioning him how the thugs had ended up like that. And Huang explains again, stating that it was caused by a mysterious guy who was passing by and helped him. Given all that, the officer in charge of the case immediately deduced that those weaklings could never have organized such a scheme and said that surely there was someone behind it. And as the criminals were being carried away by the paramedics, he ordered that they be interrogated as soon as they were fully awake. The detective's assistant was still curious despite everything, wondering who could have beaten those guys so badly. And according to the detective, it was all caused by a man passing by. Despite that, he was more concerned about whether the criminals would survive, something the assistant confirmed that despite their serious injuries, they would be fine. He continued, asking what they should do about this part of the case, and the detective took out his cigarette, saying they'd do the obvious. Search for evidence in the city's cameras and find out who it was. It was too weird to let go without an investigation. Outside, however, Kang In and John were more cautious. After all, as the young man walked through the city, the system always alerted him about the cameras on the way, keeping maximum secrecy on the path. Seeing that the situation was finally safe, Kang In finally allowed himself to relax, sighing and commenting on the unexpected awakening of the scammer. It gave him a big scare, but John explained to him that it was just an unconscious reflex of the body, nothing more. Sighing, Kang In asks John if he had a phone function, which unfortunately was not the case. So, returning to the cyber cafe, he decides that he will need one if that's the case. Since that event, 3 calm days passed approximately. The next day, after rescuing the hacker boy, Kang In immediately went after the registered address in his name to get information about himself. But he was disappointed to find out that all there was a huge field, empty in that place, and all he had to rely on were baseless rumors that the place had burned down. All that search for meaning ended up making him think a lot about himself. Kang In began to question what his purpose was. What was he doing there? Did he really come from the future? Or does he just have contact with it from the past? Those questions haunted his mind, but with no more clues to investigate. Unfortunately, all he had were questions. His search proved a failure, and he had no choice but to return empty-handed. After that incident, the cyber cafe regained its peace, and the business took off even more. According to his colleague Yoon Seon, it was mainly thanks to the promotions from an influencer that the cyber cafe became a hub for visits. The establishment's special meals were only served when he was at his post, which meant that when he needed to go out to gather information, the cyber cafe did not sell its best delicacies. Despite everything, even with that type of random marketing, that unorthodox tactic surprisingly worked. Most people go just to eat, but some of them often stayed at the cyber cafe for at least an hour or 2. And as the huge demand had alarmingly increased, the boss gathered all the employees to introduce the new hire who would share the workload with them. Ironically, the so-called new employee was surprisingly Seung-hwan, the same hacker the protagonist had saved 3 days ago. He recognized him immediately. Juan introduced himself, saying he was great with computers and would be happy to provide his services from then on, being very polite and respectful to his 2 colleagues. And as big as the coincidence was, the truth was that the boy had offered to work there out of guilt. He felt bad for, despite being forced to do so, having caused damage to the cyber cafe, and driven by that feeling, he ended up deciding to work hard there to ease the burden he deeply felt on his shoulders. The boss proceeded to introduce Manhwa Name In, the one known for having made that place one of the most famous in the region for its excellent cuisine, and encouraged them to get along well. The 2 stared at each other for a few moments under some tension. That was until the boy seemed to notice something, drawing Kang In's attention to it. The protagonist instantly became alert, nervous about the possibility that he had been recognized, but no, it was all a false alarm. Juan just noticed that he was older than him and corrected himself to properly address him as Big Bro, suggesting a handshake. Kang In sighed, relaxing. Luckily, it seemed that the boy didn't recognize him, so he just returned the gesture. The system, despite everything, seemed clearly worried about the boy's presence in the work environment, suggesting a plan to fire him and eliminate the danger he posed. Despite John's coldness, Kang In, even recognizing the logic behind it, refuses. He couldn't do that to him. Not yet. Sometime later, Kang In goes out into the streets to shop for the cyber cafe, with John checking the shopping list once again. And as expected, everything was perfectly in order. All the requested items had been, purchased. For a moment, Kang In finds it strange, even commenting on how particularly meticulous the system was regarding money and food. In response to this, John explains his reasons through a report which, being completely honest, the young man paid no attention to. He admits that he values the system's useful abilities to detect danger and manage money. But in the end, he questions whether all of that was really just for the pleasure of enjoying good food. But the system interrupted him with a sudden fire alert. Total silence, however, is what takes over the entire place, even as he looks around. Kang In even thinks that it might be a false alarm induced by Jean to change the subject. But that was not the case. A nearby building suddenly explodes without any warning. In an instant, the street is entirely taken over by chaos, with people running everywhere shouting for help. A real fire had started in the middle of the city, and seeing that, Kang In begins to think of something. His body was equipped with an unknown combat assistance artificial intelligence. His eyes were enhanced with augmented reality. His hearing was improved with auxiliary modules, and his legs had increased strength. He drops the bag of ingredients he was carrying. He seemed focused. If his assistant system could do all that, then putting out a fire like that shouldn't be a problem, right? He pulls back his arm, building up all the drama around his next move, and then he extends his arm to fire a supposed fire-extinguishing beam, only to completely embarrass himself. Despite the second-hand embarrassment, the young man withdraws his hand, disappointed by his inability to unleash an ice beam or something similar. A stupid thought that even makes the system itself give him a scolding about it. If he were capable of that, would he still be human? Nonetheless, when asked about the easiest way to put out the fire, John says that the most relevant thing would be to call the fire department. Unfortunately, there wasn't much he could do about the fire, but as he stands there, he hears a voice crying out from inside the burning building. It was the voice of a little girl at the top of the building and at the center of the fire. She was crying desperately, pleading for help while none of the other people knew what to do to assist her. Unfortunately, the fire department would still take 4 minutes to arrive. And as calculated by Jian himself, at the rate the fire was spreading, that girl definitely didn't have that much time to live. Without intervention, her chance of death was 99%. Hearing that, the young man couldn't stand still. He immediately puts on his mask and dons a hood to hide his face, ordering the system to find a route up there. After seconds of analysis, the system concludes that there were no more paths inside the building due to the flames, but there was a viable route outside, mapping out a course that avoided the most toxic gases. Thus, without hesitating for a moment, the young man follows the outlined route, sprinting toward the building and performing acrobatic leaps across the platforms available along the way to climb the structure. Along the way, he asks Jian to assess if there were any other victims, but no, everyone else had been evacuated after the explosion. With that settled, not needing to worry too much, he proceeds directly toward the girl, scaling the building bit by bit. He was close, but halfway there, he hears a crack, and the system quickly alerts him about an imminent explosion. Reacting swiftly, the agent leaps from where he was to another platform, holding on tightly thanks to his powerful grip. In any case, after that, He manages to reach the top of the building and finally finds the terrified girl huddled in the corner, approaching her silently and offering help to get her up. Hope returns to the girl's defeated face, who, amidst tears, thanks her savior profusely for his help. But things weren't that simple. The fire was spreading faster than expected, while explosions continued to erupt in the building. The survival rate was plummeting. Kang In asks the system if they might die there, and hearing that, even though it wasn't directed at her, the girl panics again. He orders her to stop screaming and shut up while calculating, searching for options from there. His body was enhanced, so simply jumping from there shouldn't be a problem. But, as advised against by the system, there were too many witnesses. Demonstrating some superhuman feat could severely compromise their secrecy. Kang In was running out of options and time was ticking away. But a solution comes to his mind when he fixes his eyes on the clothesline, having the idea to use it to descend. However, since all sides of the burning building were unsafe due to the fire, he ends up adapting his strategy and having the brilliant idea of tightrope walking to the other building. With that crazy idea surfacing, the girl protested furiously, but Kang In ignored her, telling her just to help and that everything would be fine. He ties the clotheslines together. Unfortunately, the system couldn't intervene by shooting the rope directly, but with its help in guiding his aim, his throw was successful. So, without further ado, even as the girl continued to complain, he reluctantly grabs her and climbs onto the tightrope. The girl was terrified but was advised not to thrash around if she didn't want both of them to die there. With the system once again assisting him, they crossed most of the distance without any real palpable problem. Everything was going well, and at that pace they would reach the other side without any turbulence. But once again, an unexpected situation arises. The rope starts to burn faster than anticipated. The fire was spreading ever more rapidly, and the rope began to destabilize as it became clear that they wouldn't both make it in time. Under that pressure, in a quick action, Kang In, at the last moment, throws the girl to the other side of the building, safely. The girl was saved, but the same couldn't be said for him, for the rope snapped and now he was in free fall. Amid the fall, Kang In, despite everything, tries to remain calm and calculate as quickly as possible, evaluating all his options, without much success. But at the last second, his body blessed with technological enhancements reacts reflexively, grabbing onto the clothesline just before falling, and thus, using gravity and acrobatic movements to his advantage, he manages to create an opening. A miraculous countermeasure was timed, running along the wall while holding onto the wire. That inhuman feat attracted the attention of all the people watching that scene, and in the end, that crazy acrobatics of his worked out. He managed to land safely on top of the other building, panting. What he had just done, not even he knew he was capable of, and the fear of death really knocked on his door there. From where he was, he went to the girl he managed to save, asking her if she would be okay, but seeing him again, especially after seeing with her own eyes him falling from a building, scared her, thinking he was a ghost. Kang In explained that he was no ghost and that he was alive, but not even the girl believed, questioning him if he would be some kind of superhuman or something of the sort, a fact confirmed by him in a somewhat dull manner. Then, still in awe, the young lady pointed out the fact that he spoke so casually with her and asked him if he happened to know her. But the reality was that the guy did it just because she seemed young. And to be honest, he didn't even know her. Despite everything, the guy was furious with the system's erroneous calculations lately. Fortunately, he was fine, but all those mistakes almost cost him his life. Jian explained himself, saying he didn't know flammable materials were used on the building's exterior, but that still didn't convince Kang In, who remained obstinate. But his dialogue with the system was suddenly interrupted by the girl he saved, calling for him. She approached, and then unexpectedly asked him if he was the same chef from the cyber cafe. So unexpected it was that Kang In was completely caught off guard, his face stricken with surprise. He could only wonder how in the world she knew that. A few hours after the incident, the video of all the agents' actions spread across social media and became famous for the incredible acrobatic skills demonstrated by him. So famous the video became that it even reached the detectives, who were curious about that new hero. They wondered about the whereabouts of that mysterious guy and questioned what kind of person he might be, casting their suspicions into the air. The only clue they had about him in some way was a plastic bag that was found very close to the scene. And after some investigation, they eventually assumed that bag there couldn't be a coincidence and that it had to belong to the so-called hero. He had let that detail slip and left the bag there to go save the girl. After searching, They found several ingredients and purchases inside that bag with a receipt inside. Everything was torn, and it was hard to read for sure. But surprisingly, the name of the store was on the receipt. The assistant suggested a search at that location, but frankly, the detective stated that he wasn't a criminal, and that it wasn't even their case. That kind of matter wasn't their business. While smoking, the same detective received a call on his cell phone and answered it. It was the detective's chief, and he announced that they had a big problem. The guy who took the call scoffed, asking if it wasn't just another false alarm like that one, but it wasn't. Apparently, someone was found dead on the 3rd floor of the building. The detectives instantly became disheartened. Just when they thought there was no misfortune in that incident, something appeared to ruin their downtime. Nevertheless, he just nodded and stated that the two would be on their way to investigate. Elsewhere in the city, Kang-in and the girl he saved just left a bathhouse. The girl stretched, relaxing her body after a nice bath. But the guy didn't seem too pleased, complaining about her nerve to ask him to pay for a bath right after saving her. Instantly, she puts on her abandoned puppy eyes, trying to victimize herself to the guy about the fact that her house had been burned down and she was alone, even though that attitude only managed to irritate him. But despite her entire melodrama, she keeps saying that she was really telling the truth, and that she was there because of a scholarship and planned to work part-time to support herself. But now, with her house burned down, she was at rock bottom and desperate. The guy suggests to her that she just starts working at anything. Obstinate, the girl didn't even know where to begin, but soon an idea comes to her mind. She mentions the cyber cafe where the protagonist worked and asks if they were hiring. Faced with that proposal, Kang-in turns his back and just tries to flee. However, through the girl's pure insistence, he eventually gives up and decides that he will take her to his boss. But before anything, he also asks her how she had recognized him so easily. She smiles, and then confirms that the truth was that she always visited the cyber cafe where he worked because of her job. She worked as a streamer, and a rather famous one at that. She didn't have a computer at home, so she always ended up frequenting the cyber cafe to stream from there. He asks a series of questions, and even though she wasn't good at games, her beauty got her 30 subscribers in her lives, which was enough to finally convince him to take her with him. When they arrive at the cyber cafe, Yunseo greets him with a tone of surprise, asking Kang-in why he took so long. And who introduces herself is the supposed new, not yet official, employee of the place, Yoon Ah-reum. Yunseo approaches Kang-in, noticing that even though he had gone shopping, he returned empty-handed and questions him about it. He comes up with a lame excuse, claiming that he got distracted by the fire and ended up losing the shopping bag. Surprisingly, the blonde actually buys the story without asking more questions, just laughing and joking about the odd fact. But in the middle of the interaction, the system joins the conversation, catching the agent's attention. It announces that given its extensive analysis, there was a great chance that several people had filmed the fire incident and that it was pertinent for them to take advantage of it to gather information online. Kang-in nods, and stepping away from there, he goes to a nearby computer to do his research. And those videos about the supposed tightrope hero were spreading at an alarming rate, where given the public's reactions, it seemed like the case would spread even more from then on. As a simple solution to the problem, Kang-in asks the system if it couldn't just hack its way through to delete that thing before it went viral, but it was unable to do so. Even having hacked the government server, it was just a combat support intelligence, and that kind of hacking was beyond its abilities. Things like identity manipulation were the most it could do as part of military defense against hacks, but at the moment that kind of ability wasn't the most useful. They would just have to wait and see what would come of it, and despite the frustration, accept that it was inevitable. And on the other side of the cyber cafe, one of the detectives who, even against his boss's orders, went after Kang-in to investigate further about the tightrope hero, was sitting. Their secrecy was in danger. He is lying down, resting in his room while the system is counting another day without finding a clue about Earth or his true identity. Our main character even tried asking on Reddit if time travel back to 2082 was possible, but all he got were trolls making fun of him for asking such a ridiculous question. The system reminds him that it is much more advanced than the technology of 202, which even Kang somewhat agrees with. After all, an AI implanted in a human body is impossible with today's technology. He shrugs off the confusion and asks the system about that recent fire incident. John explains that a body was found in the building. Our boy goes mad, wondering how they could have missed someone and if it was his fault. The system reassures him that it wasn't technically his fault. The body was found in a room they passed while climbing the building's exterior wall yesterday. Kang asks how he couldn't identify the person inside and wonders if he doesn't have infrared vision or something. The system explains that his lenses are just augmented reality devices, not infrared vision. Kang calls him clumsy for such a slip in not detecting a living human inside the building. The system clarifies that there were no signs of movement, sound, or any other indication of life in the surrounding area. As soon as Kang hears this, an idea crosses his mind. He realizes that the person might have already been dead, which makes him wonder if the fire was not an accident but a carefully planned murder. The system agrees, saying there's a chance that might be the case. It's when he hears a knock at the door, and we already know it's Detective Park there with the things Kang left on the streets. The card used to buy those items had this address. SEO sees the items and gets excited. Then our boy steps out. She quickly informs him that the officer brought back the spice the protagonist lost while watching the fire yesterday. Detective Park feels a bit uneasy upon hearing this because he thinks our boy isn't a suspect, just a passerby who happened to be there during the fire. Meanwhile, Seo jokingly comments about how amazing the Korean police are, being able to track down small business owners. The protagonist thanks the officer for his help, and Detective Park casually hands him a business card, saying that if he has any tips about the incident, he should get in touch. Our boy then asks the system if he should involve the detective, as it could help them catch the killer sooner. John reassures him that it's safe to meet the detective now that our boy has a confirmed identity. At that moment, she wonders if he's free because she wants to work with him and get closer. Meanwhile, the system tells our boy that it would be beneficial to become familiar with the local police for future operations. Kang agrees and decides to just get closer. SEO thinks he's talking to her and starts jumping with joy, saying she'd be thrilled to work with him. Her happiness quickly fades when this cold boy tells her he has a mission to complete during the day and needs to leave. Seo can't help but blush, thinking how difficult this guy really is to understand. The next scene takes us to the police station in one of the detective departments. Detective Park is surprised to see our boy there. He promptly asks if he is the owner of the things found on the street. Kang confirms that he is, and Detective Park says he shouldn't have come to the police department just to thank him personally. But our boy replies that he's not there for that. Park's smile fades as he asks why he's there, and our boy explains that he has information about yesterday's fire. He explains that it was actually an elaborate murder. Detective Park doesn't seem to take it seriously at first, and says that since there was a fatality, it's worth investigating. But our boy insists that there's a very high chance it was murder. The detective asks if he has any evidence. After all, random guesses from a civilian can confuse the investigation. Our boy responds that he didn't see anyone moving in the room when he was on the tightrope. At first, Detective Park doesn't react, but then his jaw literally drops, and he spills his coffee when he realizes the tightrope master is actually our boy. Kang gives a thumbs up in response, confirming it's really him, but Park asks why he didn't mention it before, to which Kang replies that he wasn't asked about it. The detective becomes frantic, asking our boy how the hell he climbed up like Spider-Man, carried someone on the rope, and then ran along the wall. The protagonist quickly reminds him that this isn't the point now. Park grabs a pen and paper, asking all the serious questions, and wanting him to explain again why he thinks it was a murder. Kang explains that there was no movement in that room even with the fire. It only makes sense if the victim was already dead or could have been intoxicated. The detective acknowledges this and assumes the building must have been set on fire intentionally to cover up the murder. At this moment, another officer joins the conversation, asking Park if the National Forensic Service has contacted him. Park replies that no, and adds that it takes time to perform an autopsy, and with the fire being so intense, they said nothing could come out now. But the officer reports that she just received news that the fire was probably caused by an electrical short circuit. The guy asks if she checked the camera, and she replies that there wasn't a single camera in the area. The officers then discuss whether they should make a sketch of all the suspects who left the building at that time. Our boy perks up at this, and quietly asks the system if it remembers the faces of the people they saw yesterday. Juwon quickly agrees, saying he stored the visual information collected before the fire, then asks if Kang wants it. Kang gives the go-ahead, and the images from the previous day begin to play. The protagonist tells Detective Park that he saw 4 people walking toward the building. He explains in detail that the first person came out of the alley by the building, holding a phone in their right hand and speaking into it. Kang mentions that the guy had a bracelet on his left wrist and a red plaid shirt with 2 buttons missing. Detective Park is left with his mouth open, surprised at the way our boy is providing. A description so precise, it's almost as if the same person were sitting right in front of him. Well, he's not entirely wrong, since the protagonist is literally writing what he's currently seeing. In any case, our boy continues with his explanation, detailing the other two people as well. Detective Park then asks if he could help create a sketch, and that's when our boy jumps out of his chair and says he can draw it. He grabs a piece of paper, clicks the pen, and says "Aya" to project the three suspects onto the paper. With that, he begins outlining the details and, a bit later, says he's finished. When the officers see his sketches, they become absolutely uneasy because his drawings look like they were drawn with his foot. But honestly, it's better than nothing. Our boy crumples up the drawing and tosses it aside, saying he needs more time. The detective acknowledges this. Kang then curses the system, asking why he didn't draw it himself. A explains that he can only move if he has temporary control. Meanwhile, the two detectives are busy calling a professional artist. At that moment, a blinding blue light shines, and Kang's subtlety catches both detectives' attention. When they look, they see the protagonist drawing as if he were a printing machine, sweating through his shirt as he draws the entire image. In the blink of an eye, everyone is amazed to see this, as his sketches look like they were made by a machine. They ask if he's some kind of genius. Our boy adds the 3 sketches and points out that only 3 people left the alley before the fire started. If the accused is fleeing, he's among those 3. The office is amazed by this insightful conclusion. That's when the senior officer steps in and orders his team to immediately check the identities of those 3. The next day, we're back at the PC room where our hero has prepared a delicious meal for his part-time colleagues. Everyone is eating when he tells the streamer that the building fire wasn't an accident, it was arson. Unsurprisingly, the streamer's jaw drops in disbelief, especially since her own apartment was also caught in the fire. It seems the case is solved, and our boy is surprised at how quickly the news has spread. Just then, he receives a call from Detective Park. The detective happily explains that they caught the culprit. Apparently, 2 of the people in the sketch were locals, but the 3rd wasn't from there. It turns out he was a friend of V. They still need to investigate the exact cause, but they found drugs in this guy's wallet. It seems he came to borrow money, and when he couldn't, he eliminated his buyer. What's even crazier is that the police quickly tracked down those selling the drugs and raided the place. They even caught a very famous actor in the middle of this mess. The protagonist can't help but point out how this whole incident is getting bigger and bigger. The detective agrees, saying it looks like there won't be any vacation for him this time, as the case won't be closed anytime soon. Still, he's happy that thanks to our boy and the sketches he drew, they were able to speed things up 100%. He often wonders if they can make these sketches public at this moment. The system tells Kang that he could become a public sensation, which will put them in the spotlight. But there's no need to hide. Eventually, our boy tells the detective he doesn't mind if the sketches are posted, but he only wants them to keep quiet about who drew them. His co-workers get excited about what he's saying on the phone. Detective Park can't help but point out that he's a real hero. Kang brushes it off, saying he's just doing his job. The others get even more excited, quickly asking what he drew for Detective Park. The protagonist just shrugs, claiming it was just a little doodle. The 3 start laughing, teasing that the drawing must have been very bad if he doesn't want to mention that he drew it. But our boy simply says they can think what they like. Suddenly, there's a commotion nearby, and it seems a guy just spilled his ramen. CO murmurs about how these clumsy customers keep spilling ramen. The hacker tells the streamer to take care of the cleanup. Minutes later, she finishes cleaning the mess and begins to consider asking her boss for a bonus for it. Suddenly, she bumps into someone while walking, and CO panics, apologizing repeatedly and asking if he's okay. The man tells her to be careful and complains that she hurt his wrist. Meanwhile, the protagonist watches the entire scene and asks the system if the wrist is actually broken. Joe quickly reports that, based on the hand's movement, there's a possibility of a fracture, but to be sure, he'd need to touch the hand and observe the person's response. Kang gives the green light and then approaches. He grabs the customer's wrist, and the system quickly reports that the muscles, ligaments, and joints are fine and without bone damage, but the wrist is sprained. Kang promptly tells the customer that his bone is fine, it's just a light sprain, and he assures that he'll help ease the pain. SEO can't help but feel admiration. Rick highlights that our boy is also very good at massages. The girl thinks about injuring herself since it's the only way to get his massage. Kang, on the other hand, tells the man to avoid any strenuous work until tomorrow, otherwise it will worsen. The man explains that he can't live without cooking. It's part of his job. He reveals that he runs a food truck and is recording a film nearby, so they hired him. SEO volunteers to help him, but the man isn't so sure and asks if she can really cook. The girl admits she knows how to cook ramen very well, but the customer says that no matter how terrible the situation is, he can't just serve ramen. He wonders if anyone is good at cooking and could help. That's when he starts looking at our boy with innocent eyes. The system asks our boy to say yes despite this, but Kang declines the customer. However, the customer quickly increases the offer. saying he'll pay 300,000 if he helps. As soon as that number registers in Kang's head, he shouts excitedly, asking if he only needs to cook rice and some side dishes. The customer confirms and gets excited, feeling honored to receive help from someone like our boy. He recalls hearing that this PC room has a reputation for good food. He only came to take a look. The food was apparently very delicious, so he's been coming back since, thinking he might learn something. But now, the legend himself is about to help him, and he feels there's nothing to worry about. At this moment, we hear our boy talking to the system, and we find out that he agreed to help because he plans to investigate other regions as well, and the money he's receiving is just a bonus. Soon, the next morning arrives, their food truck rolls down the road, and Kang is driving. The customer is genuinely impressed to see how Kang's driving skills are incredible. He didn't even realize his truck could drive so smoothly. By the way, let's give a name to this man and call him Franklin. Franklin then recalls the recent incident, mentioning that the news was about an actor being paid at a party full of narcotics. Our boy agrees, saying that he also heard about it. Frank reveals that the place they're going to is where the same actor was filming, and the movie was supposed to be released in about a week. Kang asks if they're still going to release it now that the main actor was caught in something like that. Franklin just shakes his head, asking who would want to watch a movie with an addicted actor now. They are reshooting all the scenes the actor had filmed before. Franklin says he's happy to be working there, but the atmosphere is intense, and everyone is struggling to reshoot all the scenes with a new actor. Kang asks why they just don't postpone the release. Franklin says it's a bit complicated. They've already locked in a ton of theaters, so if they delay, they might lose all those slots, and the production company could sink. Kang points out that the director must be having a hard time now. Franklin responds positively, but says this director is one of the top romance film directors in Korea, so he's sure everything will be fine. At this moment, the scene shifts to the director himself, who is smoking a cigarette, trying to vent. He seems completely defeated as nothing is going the way he planned. The guy next to him notices the tension and nervously asks if they should redo the scene. The director only murmurs that they don't have time and are stuck having to settle with this garbage. He is absolutely furious, thinking about how his big project was ruined by that addicted scoundrel. He then lets out a frustrated scream, saying he's going to finish off that wretch. At that moment, his assistant reports that the food truck is ready and suggests going to eat, especially since the crew is exhausted. But the director gets irritated and asks how he can think about food now. If this movie fails, they will be in debt, and even the cost of the food truck is a waste. So he just tells the assistant to tell the truck driver to go away. Shortly after, the director was tasting Kang's food. He seems completely calm, as if a switch was flipped. The guy even asked if they enriched the food with some narcotics. Anyway, Director Timon was furious, thinking about how his big project was jeopardized by that addicted actor. He even threatens to put an end to that miserable man. At that moment, his assistant approaches and says that the team is exhausted, then suggests eating at the food truck. The director laughs at this idea and asks how he can think about food now. If this movie fails, they will be in debt, and even the food truck cost is a waste. So, he just tells the assistant to tell the truck driver to leave. Shortly after, we see Director Tae eating the protagonist's food. He seems like a different person. So calm he is, and even wonders if they enrich the food with some narcotic. Apparently, Tae is traumatized by this subject. The assistant replies to the director that the original owner of the food truck hurt his wrist, and therefore hired a chef to help in the kitchen. And to be honest, this young man is quite impressive with his culinary skills. He also reminds the director of how beautiful the environment they are in is, then suggests staying positive and relaxing a little. The assistant adds that he's glad at least the other actors didn't have any issues. But as soon as the assistant says this, someone shouts to the director, informing him there was an accident. Unsurprisingly, the director's face changes expression when he hears this. He throws his chopsticks to the ground and runs toward the injured man who is screaming in pain. The poor guy apologizes to Tae for this mess and says he should have been more careful. His ankle quickly swells and he can't stand up. The director quickly orders someone to call 119. As if it couldn't get worse, someone in the crowd reminds everyone that calling an ambulance in the mountains is practically impossible. The director immediately asks if there is anyone here who can at least give first aid, but all he gets in response is silence. Meanwhile, our two chefs start watching the commotion, and Franklin even jokes that this movie seems cursed. He then asks our boy if he can't treat something like this, since he managed to take care of his twisted wrist before. The system promptly informs Kang that if they stabilize the ankle using some field first aid techniques, It should help relieve the pain and mainly help with recovery. But the protagonist is a bit skeptical because he remembers hearing them say that the ankle was twisted. Anyway, with no choice, he decides to check for himself. So he walks over to the injured man and asks everyone to let him check. The spectators whisper among themselves, wondering how a chef can treat these injuries. And little do they know, son. Kang then turns to the director and reminds him that all he can do is provide first aid, but they will still need to send the injured guy to a hospital immediately. The director agrees. Our boy turns to the girl, addressing her as a team member, and asks if she can quickly bring a compression bandage for him. Shin seems perplexed at being so casually called a team member. The director quickly shakes her out of her thoughts and orders her to move to get the compression bandage. She agrees and starts to leave. It seems the girl hasn't gotten over how our guy just called her without even recognizing who she is. Shin feels a bit humiliated because she was an actress in the movie, even though her role is only a supporting one. Everyone knows her. At that moment, she irritably hands the bandages to MC. Kang turns his attention back to the injured stuntman and applies the bandage. The actor suddenly screams in pain, drawing Shin's attention. On the other hand, Aya reveals that the injured actor severely twisted his ankle, but luckily it wasn't as bad as they described. First aid is applied. Finally complete, Shin observes the scene a little perplexed as she asks the injured man if he is okay. He responds that it hurt a lot when he got injured, but he feels very good now. It seems that his bones are back in place, and he even thinks he can walk. However, Tang says that filming will be impossible for him. After all, the stunt double only received temporary treatment, and it will be difficult to walk until he fully recovers. When the director hears this, he almost faints. His assistant quickly catches him and tries to be positive, saying they can simply call another double. Tae then asks how they can find someone with a similar build and face to Kinu and bring him to the middle of the mountains. The lead actor himself joins the conversation, saying that they don't need any other stunt double because he can play his part alone. But the director retorts, reminding everyone that this guy is clumsy as hell, and if he messes up his ankle too, they won't be able to do anything else. The actors try to find a way to continue the filming and come up with an idea. Someone says that maybe it could work if they choose someone from the crew to play the stunt double role and look. A rather strange idea at first. They would just cover the face with a mask and dark glasses. It's the only option the team found, but it doesn't seem like such a good idea for the director, who sinks even more into despair, asking God why he has to endure this torment. Suddenly our boy steps forward, declaring that the person sent from heaven has arrived. Right? The kid admits that it may seem like a joke, but he is really confident he can handle the job. And the guy does everything himself. Really. Shin begins to get furious, saying there's no way they're letting this completely random guy into the movie, right? After all, he's not even an aspiring actor or part of the crew, just a mere chef who drives a food truck. It seems that the girl hasn't gotten over not being recognized by the lead. The director doesn't pay attention to her complaints and looks at our guy standing side by side with King. The man starts to see a certain resemblance between the two and quickly walks over to Kang and asks if he has any physical skills. Since the crew is pressed for time, they could make a few exceptions, even if the kid is less experienced. The director wants to finish filming and makes it clear that he's willing to apply a bit of makeup to make him look as much like the original actor as possible. The lead actor promptly agrees, but demands to be paid 3 times as much for this show. The director agrees without a second thought. After all, the guy was even more desperate than he was, while the actress and the assistant literally start crying, thinking that the movie is definitely doomed. Moments later, everyone returns to the set. The director explains that since Kin is the male protagonist, he has to save Shin, who is the supporting actress. The actor who was originally supposed to play the villain in this scene was the same actor caught with the narcotics, and he's also responsible for making the director have to re-record everything. That's why they're in such a hurry. After explaining everything, the director says he's going to smoke a pack of cigarettes over there while everyone gets ready. Meanwhile, the protagonist spends a good amount of time studying the script alongside the trio of supporting actors. They are explaining a fight scene with plenty of physical movements. One of the actors explains that in practice, the choreography is pretty simple, and they can train like this. At this moment, she reads the script and finds it horrible. She points out that this isn't how the filming should be done. The system speaks from experience since it had some filming skills and training manuals. She explains that this particular scene requires more practical movements. With that in mind, the protagonist tells the trio of actors that they didn't need to pretend. To be more natural, it would be better to attack him for real. Obviously, the guys are left wondering what this crazy guy is talking about. Kang explains to them to attack him as if they were actually fighting him. The boy promises to handle it appropriately, and it will look much more realistic on camera. But everyone raises concerns that if someone gets hurt, it could ruin their entire movie, as everything is now in the hands of selected actors. Meanwhile, Shin, with her usual arrogance, throws her weight around frustratingly, asking what our boy knows about acting well. It's worth noting that she's still angry at Kang for not recognizing her as one of the famous actresses. Anyway, our boy doesn't pay attention to this and goes to get into character. He dresses according to his character and turns to the director, asking if they can shoot it. It's a one-shot take. He was planning to go straight into action without a rehearsal. Asking if they can film this is a take without CTE. He was planning to go straight into action, without rehearsal, thinking that this way they can save time. The director seems skeptical, but says that if he can get it right in one take, it would be great. Still, Tae isn't sure if it's possible, right? The protagonist just reminds the man to trust in the power of triple pay. And with that, he walks out declaring that they will go ahead without cuts or interruptions. The director has no idea what to say, and just nodding his head is the only thing he can do at the moment besides his experience as a top-tier director tells him that this guy seems trustworthy. Yes, the filming finally begins with the opening scene showing the damsel in distress. Shin is screaming for help while the thugs approach her, perfectly embodying their roles as secondary characters. Suddenly, Kang enters the scene with a dramatic kick on the door after jumping from above and landing right in front of the thugs, leaving the three henchmen completely perplexed, wondering how in the hell he managed that anyway. He remembers the initial instructions about attacking as if they were really fighting, so without wasting time, they launch at our Kang Aya prepares, promising to help him by marking the expected punches. With that, our guy easily ducks to avoid any punches from his partners. He then dodges the second punch as well. The third attack is a bit different, and the actor tries to sweep Kang, who simply jumps over the attempt. Once again, the system then identifies the spot he should grab, and our boy promptly grabs the lackey next. He swings him in the air and unleashes a barrage of punches. Once this guy is out of the scene, Kang jumps on the next thug and attacks him right in the head. The last thug panics, realizing that the protagonist is not following the script to make things worse. The director also isn't calling. Cut. Eventually, the thug runs toward our boy, who quickly ducks and delivers a head strike using his own head, then follows up with a solid knee strike straight to the guy's stomach. After that, he hits the thug with a baseball bat. These moves leave the director's jaw on the floor, and not only him but everyone watching is in awe, while the poor guys playing villains are knocked down like flies. Kang wipes sweat off his forehead after this epic moment and promptly starts walking towards Shin. The girl now seems much more scared of her savior than of those thugs. Maybe it would have been safer with those goons instead. Meanwhile, the protagonist continues following the script and promptly tells her he was there to save her. But the actress is so panicked that she says some nonsense there. She seriously asks if he's going to knock her down too. Right then, the director finally calls cut and starts shouting, reminding Kang that he was supposed to act as if he were hitting the thugs and not. The protagonist literally begins to scold himself, saying that he was in such a rush to finish the movie that he didn't pay attention to what was really happening. At this moment, surprisingly, one of the actors playing the villain stands up, leaving the director and everyone else on set totally confused. After all, this guy was supposed to be knocked out. Eventually, all three villains stand up, apparently without a scratch. One of them says that although our boy was hitting them, they actually didn't feel any pain. No, the director didn't expect this twist and had no idea how to react to it. Meanwhile, the assistant enters the scene, asking Kang what the hell he's doing, actually hitting people, right? He's so busy trying to reprimand our boy that he doesn't even realize that the villains who were just beaten up are absolutely fine and safe. As he finally notices, everything goes silent, and his face shifts from furious to an expression of confusion. He quickly asks the trio if they are really okay. The actors respond that they're not sure either. But one thing is certain, it felt like there was some kind of padding or something. It was more like they were sliding rather than being hit. The assistant calls it madness, while our boy tries to explain the science behind it. He says that those punches are like when you slide sideways on skis. Of course, this still doesn't make sense to the assistant, so he quickly turns to one of the actors and reminds him of how he was hit by Kang's knee and his body flew upward. Remembering this, he asks why the actor isn't hurt at all. The guy simply says he didn't feel anything. The knee kind of slid over his body, but the assistant insists that his camera clearly filmed him getting beaten up, so he doesn't understand how it could not hurt at all, or how there's not even a single scratch. It seemed like something from another world. Finally, director Tae steps onto the scene and decides to call it a day for filming. He laughs loudly, claiming he knew the whole time that everything would end up fine, which is why he didn't stop filming.